Hey guys, Flanagan here, checking in with you this time about our last topic, which is the Phillips curve. So we're going to start off with a quick review of ADAS, our graph with AD, Larraz, and Serraz, and jump into the Phillips curve itself. So our note for this time, if you happen to hear some piano playing in the background, that is my wife playing piano in the background. She does that sometimes. So I tested it. I don't think it's too loud, but if it is, let me know and I can play with the audio settings a little bit. So before we get into the Phillips curve, a quick ADAS recap. You can read it here. The key thing is that we want to be able to see pretty quickly or know in your head, or if you need to do a quick little scratch graph, what happens when AD decreases and when AD increases. You want to think about what happens to specifically price level and unemployment. I put GDP here in the middle because that part about GDP can help you figure out unemployment, because those two are always inverse, opposite of each other. Take a minute, read back on that if you need to. All right, so this is the graph for the short run Phillips curve. So I already have it filled in for you. The short run Phillips curve, the whole point of this graph is that it shows the trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the short run. That's why it's called the short run Phillips curve, or the SRPC. So point A right here. We'll talk about why this is what we call equilibrium, like any other graph, in just a second. But the big thing here is we label the y-axis up top inflation and the x-axis down here unemployment. So again, we're only looking at the relationship between changing prices and unemployment. So here I just label these axes with sort of random percentages. The only ones that really matter here are 2% inflation and 5% unemployment. 2% inflation is the goal for our economy. If we can keep prices rising less than 2% a year, then we're doing okay, somewhere between 1 and 2%. Unemployment, we generally say we want unemployment to be somewhere between 4 and 5%, because 0% unemployment is impossible in our economy. So 5% would be very high inflation, and 10% would be very high unemployment. Well, here these would be on the lower end. So point A represents full employment. This is our ideal location because inflation is 2%, which is our goal, and unemployment down here is at 5%, which is also our goal. 2% unemployment would be too low, 10% would be far too high. So this is the happy spot right here in the middle. Point B, if you're asked to show a recession on this graph, this clearly point B shows recession, because if we were to graph out ADAS in a recession, which is below full employment, that means we're not producing a whole lot. So unemployment is high, like 10%, but also prices are low. Inflation is not very high because people aren't going to be able to afford those higher prices. So we're not really going to see inflation in the midst of a recession. Point C up here at the top, this would be a point that we could call beyond full employment, or just a time of inflation, because up here we have really high inflation, more than double what it should be, but unemployment is really low. We're producing so many things, we're kind of overheating, that prices are going up, but unemployment is going down. So that's what we mean by the trade-off. If we move from A to B, unemployment goes up, but inflation goes down. That's the trade-off. Going from A to C, inflation goes way up, but unemployment goes down. So that's the trade-off. You know, inflation being high is not great, but a lot of people are working, so that's what we mean by trade-off. So question always comes up, do I move a point along the short run Phillips curve, or do I shift the entire thing? So I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. You can read it. I spelled it out. It makes as much sense for you to just kind of pause it right here and read it. The big idea is that if AD increases, this is what happens on the graph. We can see what happens to price level and unemployment. So if AD increases, we can assume that we started here at point A. If AD shifts to the right, which is our top scenario, price level increases, which is inflation, but unemployment decreases. So that would shift us from point A to point C. We can see that shift of AD to the right on the short run Phillips curve. Same thing down here. If AD decreases, here's the effect on inflation and unemployment. If price level goes down, inflation goes down, and unemployment goes up, we can see that on this curve without actually shifting the curve. Going from A to B would show us dipping into a recession. So again, down here at the bottom, it says a shift in AD will actually move a point along the short run Phillips curve. Anytime AD shifts left or right, just look at what happens to inflation and unemployment, and you can plot your new point somewhere, either up here or down here, and just label it however they tell you to. So, question always is then, well, should I ever shift the short run Phillips? Does it happen? I would say generally it's more commonly asked for you to graph just a new point, but it can happen. Short run Phillips curve has popped up a lot the last few years on the AP macro, so we don't know if this is a new trend that's really popular or if it was kind of a short-term fad. So that's why we're covering it right here at the end. It's pretty simple with inflation and unemployment anyways. So we want to think of the short run Phillips curve as a mirror image of Seurat's, meaning if Seurat shifts to the left, short run Phillips curve shifts to the right. So here's an example I use with stagflation. If Seurat shifts to the left, we see price level increase and unemployment increase. That should be ringing alarms. And well, that's not right because it's supposed to show a trade-off. Both can't go up. Exactly. So in order to show an increase in both price level and unemployment, we actually can't even see that on this graph because inflation goes up here, but yikes, unemployment went down. Well, unemployment goes up here, but yikes, inflation went down. So we cannot show a simultaneous increase in inflation and unemployment on the short run Phillips curve. So what we have to add in is a shift. We'll actually add in a different curve in just a second, but if we have stagflation, which we can see over here on the left on our ADAS graph, Seurat's Beyonce, Seurat shifting to the left is stagflation. Price level goes up, and since GDP goes down, unemployment goes up. So to show an increase in both unemployment, let's say from going 5% to 10%, and an increase in inflation going from 2% to 4%, a point on the original short run Phillips does not work. So we need to actually shift short run Phillips to the right so we can plot a point right there and see where both inflation and unemployment increase. So on your notes page, skip the top of page 2 for now. You should be done with page 1. Skip that first part of your page, go to the little line below it with the long run Phillips curve. This is very rarely asked about, and it's almost never shifted, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. The long run Phillips curve, basically, this was created because stagflation kind of ruined the short run Phillips curve. The short run Phillips curve was like, well, we can't show a point on it, so we need to put in a long run Phillips curve to point out here that in the long run, there is actually no trade-off between inflation and unemployment, because anytime AD shifts to the right or to the left out of long run equilibrium, that is a temporary economic problem. We temporarily go into recession or temporarily into inflation. That is not a long run situation. So eventually, either AD or Seurat's will shift to bring us back to long run equilibrium with Seurat's, and AD, and also back into long run equilibrium with the long run Phillips curve. So there's a little explanation you can read on your notes handout there where it starts with changes in AD will affect. Take a minute and read that. You can pause. So this is what a Phillips curve graph looks like with short run, which we just saw, and long run. So we still label it inflation, still label it unemployment, except here they're saying that in the long run, there is no trade-off in terms of unemployment and inflation because our natural rate of unemployment, which is our 5%, I should have this labeled down here, 5%, that never changes. Our optimal level of unemployment is 4 to 5%. So that's why this line is completely vertical right there. So like I said right there on that last one, only graph what they tell you. If they only ask for short run, only give them short run. If they ask for both, draw a short run and drop in a vertical long run Phillips curve. If they ask you to label with percentages, by all means use the same ones I did, 1%, 2%, 5%, and then 2%, 5%, 10%. If they don't ask for percentages, then as far as we know, you don't need to actually provide those percentages. So the long run Phillips curve, I don't think I've ever seen it ask for you to shift the long run. Maybe once they asked you, what curve relates to the long run Phillips curve. So that's why we have this here. The long run Phillips curve actually shows us full employment or our natural rate of unemployment, which would be down here at 5%. That's the same thing as Seurat's. Seurat's and the long run Phillips curve, again, are exact opposites. So That's also written down in your notes, so I'm not going to talk through that one. You can read that. That's pretty well spelled out. So here, full employment, just the percentage on the ADAS graph with LRAS, SRAS, and AD. LRAS shows our maximum possible output at full employment. So this just shows the percentage. This shows our full employment output. And then that also relates because LRAS and the PPC are closely related. The PPC showing our maximum possible production of capital and consumer goods given current resources and technology. And again, those two have the same shifters, the PPC and LRAS. Technology, quantity, and quality of resources, or worker productivity, if workers are better trained or better educated. So if they ever ask about long run Phillips curve and LRAS, they are mirror images of each other, and you have that explanation on your handout. So back to the top of page 2, seeing the difference. And we'll go back to the bottom of page 2 of your handout, seeing the difference between a movement along the short run Phillips curve and then an actual shift of the short run Phillips curve. Again, not going to touch on the shifting of long run Phillips. So this graph shows us ADAS, LRAS, SRAS, AD at long run equilibrium or full employment right here, point A, where all three intersect. There's our full employment output and our current price level. This right here, we'll keep referencing back to. If there is a shift of AD to the right, that would put us into a temporary short run time of inflation. We label that point B. And then in order to get us back to long run equilibrium, where all three curves are intersecting, we have right here labeled point C. So we were at long run equilibrium, we shifted out of it, and then stagflation actually pulled us back to long run equilibrium. All right, so again here, these blue letters actually represent the exact same point. So here, long run equilibrium in the ADAS model is seen right here at point A, still labeled the same on the Phillips curve, because point A from ADAS is going to be this same point A here. This represents our full employment at 5% and our ideal on inflation, which would be about 2% right here. I just didn't label the axes this time because, again, you're not always going to be required to. So though both of those point A's show the same thing. Now, moving from point A to point B, you can read this right here. We see a temporary increase in GDP. In the long run, that is not an actual increase, but temporarily, short run, increase in GDP, which means unemployment goes down, and then price level increases. So if we want to show unemployment decreasing and price level or inflation increasing, we can show that by moving along the short run Phillips curve, because we said price level increased. Back on this graph, price level went from 1 to 2, increase. But since GDP went up, unemployment went down. So if we shift from, or if we move our point from A to B, inflation increased, but unemployment decreased. So there, this point B right here is the same as this point B on the Phillips curve graph, showing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Finally, moving from point B to C, putting us back to long run equilibrium. Again, that being caused by stagflation in this case, but it does push us back to a long run happy place. That shows an increase in price level going from price level 2 to 3, but also an increase in unemployment because GDP decreases back down to YF, our full employment output. So GDP goes down, meaning unemployment goes up and price level goes up. So the problem was we couldn't actually show that on this curve by just labeling a point. We need to show both an increase of inflation and an increase in unemployment. So right here, we have the trouble of we cannot show an increase in price level and an increase in unemployment. So what we need to do is see that in the long run, we're actually not seeing a change in unemployment because, again, in the long run, this is where we started, we temporarily had an increase in GDP, but that is not a long run situation that we can be in. So unemployment remained the same in the long run, but price level still increased. So moving from point A here to point C here is mirror image, because from point A, GDP was here, And point C, it also did not change. The only thing that went up was price level from 1 to 3. So that's what we mean with the long run Phillips curve, saying that in the long run, there is not an actual trade-off between inflation and unemployment, because here we can see the only thing that increased was inflation. So in the short run, we can have this fluctuation and this trade-off going from A to B or A to down here. But in the long run, our unemployment percentage, our natural rate, does not change, only inflation will. So the major things you need to take away from this video and for this graph, first of all, how to label the Phillips curve with inflation and unemployment. Also, if we are starting at inflation, you start it up here. If you're starting at recession, we label a point down here. And then remember that short-run Phillips curve and Seurat's are opposites. So if Seurat's shifts to the left, which we saw here, Seurat's from B to C shifted to the left, then short-run Phillips, the entire curve shifts to the right, showing that in the long run there is no trade-off. So if you have questions, as always, tweet me, remind app, text, or email. Other than that, we'll see you next time.